Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Adrienne Batra. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Toronto Sun. Welcome to the session on the Canadian Brain Rewired. This is going to be informative. We hopefully will have some disagreement on this panel. Just a few housekeeping-related matters before I introduce our panelists here. For most of you, hopefully all of you, have downloaded the Attendify app. If you want to pose questions, there are microphones on the floor, but if you want to pose questions in our Q&A session, please download the app, find my name, find this session, and send me a direct note, and we will endeavor to pose your question to our panelists. Since we are just a little bit delayed, I do want to get into this right away, but I don't want to, I would be remiss if we didn't thank some of our incredible sponsors here at the Manning Center: Amazon, Google, Scotiabank, Coca-Cola. Thank you to all of our sponsors who we couldn't do this without you. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Kevin Chan. Kevin is the Global Director and Head of Public Policy at Facebook Canada. Paige McPherson is the Atlanta Director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. And Jen Gerson is a freelance writer based in Calgary and is a frequent contributor with Maclean's, Walrus, CBC, and The Washington Post. So to all three of our esteemed panelists. Jen, I'm going to begin with you. You have a table setter, as it were, on our conversation about Canadian Brain Rewired, fake news, etc. Please, go ahead.
Thank you. Should you want me to stand at the podium, or should I just do it here at the chair?
Whatever you're comfortable
All right,
with.
I'll do it at the chair. That makes it easier. So firstly, I just want to thank the Manning Center for inviting me here to be the token mainstream media panelist. I'm really looking forward to the question session. It's going to be lit. It's going to be great. And secondly, I'd like to apologize right off the front. I'm not used to delivering properly prepared remarks. Usually I just say whatever nonsense comes into my head on live television, so I'm going to do my best here. So the subject of the discussion is fake news, new media, and government interventions. I'd like to start by briefly discussing some of the broader trends we're seeing in media right now. To most of the people in this room, many of these trends will be familiar, but maybe some of them will be new. Firstly, the obvious. There are slightly fewer of us doing journalism. A Statistics Canada report from 2006 found that overall employment in journalism had declined by about 7% between 2001 and that year. And when I first heard that statistic, I was quite shocked because I've spent most of my career in mainstream media newsrooms, and trust me, it feels like it's been a lot more than 7%. What certainly has changed is where those jobs are, what those journalists are doing, how they're getting paid, and what kind of job security they can expect, and that all has broader implications for how the news actually gets covered. There is absolutely no dispute that traditional news outlets are largely on the decline, particularly in Canada. They're suffering from a loss in circulation and struggling to reconstruct their business models. Most are now trapped in what I would call an unvirtuous circle, forced to lay off staff, which reduces the quality of the content, which scatters readers, which brings in less money, and so on and so on. But contrary to popular belief, the problem that most outlets are facing is not actually lack of readership. Thanks to the internet, most outlets have access to more eyeballs now than they could ever have imagined possible, even in their most profitable heydays. The problem is this: an eyeball that reads from a screen is worth a fraction of an eyeball that reads from a piece of paper. Most media outlets simply can't compete with Google and Facebook, which can both provide highly targeted advertising to specific locations and demographics at a fraction of the cost of print advertising. That's the problem in a very summed up nutshell. This massive disruption of the business model has led to some good and poor outcomes for society overall, kind of depending on how you want to look at it. The downside, from my perspective, or one of the downsides, is that journalists themselves are now caught up in the realities of content production, constantly churning out video, audio, and written online content that is quite ruthlessly aggregated, scored, and judged by metrics like click-throughs and time spent on site. Secondly, it seems to me that journalists are increasingly younger. I haven't ruled out the possibility that I'm getting older, but I keep on going into newsrooms and all I see are baby faces, man. Most of us are now much more reliant on contracts and freelance work. I'm now in that bucket. I'm a freelance journalist. Fewer institutions have the resources to hire full-time staff. There's virtually nothing left in the bank for any kind of mentorship. Some of the most storied internships programs in Canadian media are now completely gone. They've been cut entirely. And as a result, what I fear is that this is increasingly going to become a job for people in their 20s who then move on to higher paying industries, rather than a lifelong career or vacation. That leads to consequences like damaging effects on training, decline in standards, lack of institutional knowledge, and I think probably most importantly, a reduction in narrowing in perspective. Lastly, I would say this disruption has broken the hierarchical gatekeeping model of old media. In Canada, we've seen the rise of smaller, more nimble, and increasingly much more ideologically driven media outlets. Only a few examples I'm going to name here: Canadaland, Vice, Press Progress, Progress Alberta, Ontario Proud, The Rebel. These are outlets that simply could not have existed prior to the massive democratization of media distribution. And these outlets are becoming increasingly influential. Many of them are doing original reporting and breaking excellent stories that the mainstream media have overlooked or simply can't get. This is all to the good. But there's a dark side to all of this. These outlets are newer, younger, they're not rooted in kind of traditional legacy media values, and as a result, they don't always adhere to traditional standards of decorum, fairness, due diligence, and accuracy. And I'm going to make the necessary aside here. Yes, I'm perfectly aware that not all media outlets in all cases have always managed to adhere to those standards as well, but they're still fundamental tenets of most mainstream legacy media outlets. They're not necessarily in some of these new and emerging outlets, and there's a fundamental difference there. So these new distribution models are leading to polarization of media consumption, which I'm sure people are very well aware of at this point. It allows individuals to indulge their cognitive dissonances. They cherry pick perspectives that suit their own view of the world. And it's from this instinct that we see the rise of fake news, a label that I will stick only to the most obviously deceptive form of media, such as websites that are designed to look like real news to try and fool people. They often publish fantastic, wholly unsourced material to harvest clicks. Often it's conspiratorial in nature, and it tries to target people at their most base level emotions. As a society, I believe that we have not yet developed some of the critical intellectual immune systems required to parse through that landscape yet. There are already signs that younger generations are getting much better at spotting what's credible and what isn't, and that's a really good sign, but it's going to take time. And in the meantime, we're left with generations of traditional news consumers who can very easily be taken in with plausible conspiracies that spread on social media. I would say the anti-vaccination movement is probably one of the most obvious, harmful mainstream versions of this phenomenon. However, I would also note that this breakdown isn't limited to media, and nor is it limited to social media. It's in line with what we see. It's in line with the dissolution of trust that we're seeing in broader civil society. So not only are people sharing nonsense about vaccines from that mommy Facebook group, but they do it because they've lost faith in the doctors who tell them the truth. They've lost faith in the scientific establishment that studies the safety of vaccines, in the politicians and celebrities who tell them what they don't already believe, in Health Canada, in the CDC. On that happy note, what should the government's role be in mediating all of this? Is it appropriate for a federal task force to be constructed to monitor the coming election for foreign interference, for example? I think Paige is going to speak more to that, but I have my doubts. The core problem here isn't Facebook or media, it's us, how we consume the information that we consume, how we decide to pick out our tribal loyalties, and how we choose to not address our own internal biases. And most of all, it's the faith that we choose to maintain in our institutions. Further on government intervention, I would stand with most of the people in this room by stating that the government media bailout that was spelled out in the recent budget is not the solution. There are some aspects... easy applause on that one. Look, there are some aspects of the bailout that are probably less harmful than others, but on the whole, I think it will do little good and will basically just further undermine faith in media. Partisans are already using that bailout to undermine media credibility. However, I want to note, particularly to the tweeters in the room, I know who you are, that this bailout has inspired as much concern and ambivalence among journalists as among you. The government wasn't asking people like me when it decided to hand the media industry a bunch of money. And this Byzantine scheme it's constructed is the result of lobbying efforts by some of the most powerful and wealthy executives in the journalism industry. It is designed from the bottom up to protect the predictable players like Postmedia, Globe and Mail, and the Torstar. I'm going to quote, I'm sure somebody who's very popular in this room, Jesse Brown, who's created a startup podcast organization called Canadaland. I helped produce one of their political podcasts. He basically critiqued the bailout at length on Twitter a few days ago, and his quote is, "It's increasingly clear that Canada is embarking on a bizarre media experiment, a weird kind of government interference with the free and independent press, the likes of which the world has never seen. It's not Putin or PRC-style state media, it's something else, something very Canadian, all about rewarding cronies and lobbyists, locking out upstarts, and maintaining the status quo." I think that he's, hand-wringing over Putin is maybe a little overwrought, but on the whole, he has it about right here. And it gets to the problem with the core of government interference in so many areas. I would also further add to this that the Canadian government already does interfere with the free market of free press through the CBC, which even competes for now dwindling advertising dollars. A healthy CBC with its resources focused on producing local news for regions underserved by a failing private media is probably going to be a necessity in the years to come, but the CBC risks becoming a crushing monopoly of Canadian journalism unless that organization makes a real effort to critically examine its mandate, and I think it absolutely needs to. So to sum up here, and then I'll turn it over, what I see facing the media industry in Canada is a real mixed bag. I've been in mainstream media for about 12 years now, and my running dark joke is that I've attended more funerals than retirement parties. But in truth, I see no reason to be totally catastrophic in the long run. The future won't look like the past, and I don't think that we are ever going back to a model in which every single city in this country can support a newsroom of hundreds of people. But I do see in nimble startups and pared-down legacies a lot of room to hope. Mainstream media, however you want to define that, and let's be clear, I define it very broadly, remains a powerful voice in the Canadian conversation, and one that I don't think should be underestimated, and one that I don't think is going to get replaced by Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. But the relationship we have with our audience is being fundamentally renegotiated. I think that those of us in the media can choose to see this time as an opportunity, we can choose to see this as a time of either enormous peril or one of great opportunity.
Super, thank you, Jen. Lot covered there, which we will dive into a little bit further, specifically on the government intervention. But now I'd like to ask Kevin to give us your thoughts, your take on it, because at Facebook, you're now dealing with federal legislation that is going to require fundamental changes to how we see advertising during elections. So please.
Great. Well, thank you. Merci beaucoup. Je vais juste commencer en disant que je pense qu'on veut tous la même chose. On veut une élection libre et juste en octobre. So I just want to start by saying I think we all want the same thing. We want a free and fair election in October. And we have been making a lot of investments on our end to ensure that we do our part. So I just want to outline a couple of things, and we can talk a bit further, obviously, in the panel and the Q&A. But we've made significant investments in people, in technology, and in partnerships in the last 2 years. And so when you think about it, people, we've tripled the number of security people working at Facebook, so from 10 to 30,000 people globally, to make sure that we are identifying and removing harmful and abusive content. We have invested significantly in artificial intelligence. That technology can proactively allow us to find things like fake accounts. Because if you guys are on Facebook, you'll know you actually have to be yourself on Facebook. We have an authentic identity policy. And so if you're actually a bad actor, you usually don't do it under your own name. You kind of go and create a fake account and try to kind of get up to some mischievous activity. The AI now, basically through pattern recognition, can say, well, these accounts that are fake don't behave like real people. So we can kind of find them en masse and remove them. And in I think in Q2 and Q3 of 2018, we took down something like 1.5 billion fake accounts in those 2 quarters. And then in terms of partnerships, we're really excited to be partnering with organizations like MediaSmarts, which is a digital literacy organization. We talked a bit about that already. And we're also partnering with the Walrus on a local news initiative to try to support local news through an accelerator program that we're launching later this spring. So with these investments, I guess I'd like to just sort of talk a bit about sort of how are we doing? How do we think we're doing? And of course, our work can never be done because the work that we're engaged in is fundamentally a security issue. So we're kind of dealing with bad actors, some of them with geopolitical interests. And as we evolve our systems and our ways of doing things, I mean, we can only expect that our adversaries will do the same thing. But in 2018, we've had 4 elections, right? Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick. We've had the BC municipal elections. We've had 3 by-elections federally. And in all these cases, we've had channels and protocols established with the electoral commissions across this country. And I'm pleased to say that we've been able to either proactively find and identify bad actors or resolve issues that are reported to us in every instance. And so we feel pretty good. Again, I don't want to say that our job will ever be done. But as we look to October, we do have a protocol now with Elections Canada and the Commissioner for Canada Elections. And I think we feel like increasingly our posture is one where we are going to be able to deal with any kind of significant threats. Obviously, the Alberta election is happening, as you all know, and so I just want to also be clear that we are certainly working to ensure that there is no malfeasance on our platform during that election, and so we are working hard, and if you do find things, you should report them on the platform, because that's what the team's there for. We have now a dedicated cross-functional team of a few dozen people working on Canadian elections, including the one currently happening in Alberta. C-76, just briefly, you know, the law, Parliament passed the law back at the end of last year. It requires, actually, it does regulate online platforms, right, as was noted earlier. It actually requires us to not knowingly accept foreign funds to run political advertising during a campaign. So we're going to have some kind of authorization process for that. So for all people who are out there campaigning, or expect to be campaigning in October, you should come visit the Facebook booth, because we're going to have more information there about what to expect, so that we can sort of start helping you get ready for this authorization process. And it requires us to put all political ads into an ad library that are going to be running during the pre-writ and writ period. And while the Act kind of says, look, a political advertiser has to give Facebook or Twitter or whoever else all the information it needs to comply. So they give us the information we put into the archive. We're pretty sure that bad actors aren't going to be kind of self-declaring, right, if they're out to do something bad. And so what we are doing now is going to be building some proactive enforcement measures, basically building AI systems to try to catch people who are trying to run political ads on Facebook but haven't self-declared. To do that, we actually need to understand a bit what are the issues that we expect to come up in the next federal election. And we don't think Facebook's the right entity to do that. And so we're really glad to be working with a group of really prominent Canadian leaders in an advisory group that are advising us on what these issues are. And I'm just really pleased and honored to share that Ray Novak has agreed to be on the advisory group.
Thank you very much. Before we hear from Paige, I do want you to define, in your view, what are bad actors? We hear it over and over again. How would you define it?
Yeah, I think, for us, bad actors are obviously people who are breaking the law or are violating our community standards. And if you've taken a look at our community standards, and you can read about them at facebook.com/community standards, it's people who are inciting violence, who are glorifying or promoting terrorism, people who are putting things like pornography on Facebook. So these things, I hope we all agree, shouldn't be on the platform. And that's, when we talk about bad actors, we're talking about that kind of, the people who behave in that way. Maybe if I may, I'll just say one last thing on this. I've spent a lot of time with conservative-minded folks, many of you potentially in the room. And I do want to be very clear, we hear you loud and clear about the concerns about censorship. We don't want to be doing that. We're working very hard to strike the right balance, which is why you oftentimes hear that, well, Facebook didn't take this down, they didn't do this. It's because we understand the importance of freedom of expression. We understand the seriousness of what the internet and what Facebook means, which is to give everybody a voice online. And we are very careful about not overstepping the bounds and inadvertently censoring legitimate speech.
Perhaps someone from Twitter could answer that question too. Paige, you come at this from a advocacy perspective. You are in the media, you talk to mainstream media and through interviews and advocating on behalf of your supporters to change government policy. So how do you view this notion of the Canadian brain rewired?
So I come at this from an advocacy perspective, and certainly I think that we have a changing face of media where we're in sort of a purgatory stage of media, where I think media professionals are trying to figure out how the industry is changing and how they can rapidly adapt, and they're attempting to do that. I too have worked in newsrooms that have gone from 20 to 2, and it's crazy to see, and it is concerning on a number of levels, but I think there's two things going on. There's that, the changing face of media and media needing to catch up to that. But and how that actually is empowering in many ways for advocacy groups and just for people, because it in a lot of ways is a lot more democratic, because we've got a lot more voices participating as opposed to just those big players. That's a big change. But then there's also this concept of fake news, which in my opinion, I guess if we're going to define it, it's outright lies disguised as truth. It's not just an opinion that you don't like. And so I think we need to be clear about that. But I also don't think that fake news is new at all. And I don't think even foreign influence trying to meddle in other countries' elections is new through media. I mean, in 1898, you had William Randolph Hearst with his newspaper trying to incite military action in the Spanish-American War to create conflict to sell more newspapers. That was sort of the start of yellow journalism and propaganda through media. It's sort of seen as that sort of a turning point. And so media has been used to influence people or wars or elections in other countries for a long time. This is not a new problem that we're dealing with, even though I think it's kind of trendy. But that doesn't mean it's not a legitimate problem. I think everybody can agree that it is a legitimate problem, especially if we're dealing with outright lies disguised as truth that people will consume. As you said, Jen, people who have been used to consuming objective news from the mainstream media, or in often cases objective news, seeing things that are not true as truth, that's problematic. And foreign meddlers in our elections, that's a big problem. But I don't think that government can solve this problem, and I don't think that they have put forward any convincing solutions that will give anyone any comfort as to the idea that the government is going to solve the problem. And in fact, I think that government doing something for the sake of doing something, to look like they're acting, to give people some sense of comfort or something, is actually going to make the problem worse for a number of reasons. Part of that is that free speech and democratic participation in our elections, or just in our broader political process or our broader public conversation on any given policy issue, is absolutely essential to having a vibrant democracy. And the government deciding what is legitimate and what should be able to be said is extremely problematic. What we have now with this changing face of media is essentially, yes, we have the collapse of newsrooms, and yes, we have a lot fewer people reading news on a newspaper. And I say that as somebody who really loves newspapers. I subscribe to print newspapers. Actually, I have them delivered to my door. But that doesn't mean that that's the way that it always has to be. I mean, we've had, it's so funny to watch even, movies that come out about newspapers even a few decades ago, and just look at the amount of jobs that were in those newsrooms that had to go into producing newspapers that just no longer exist. But that doesn't mean that we're not still getting news. I don't really view this as a public information problem. The internet has given each one of us access to an unbelievable amount of information, more than we've ever seen before, through a variety of different sources. So the question then becomes, is this a public information problem that maybe the government should be concerned about? Or is this a jobs problem in a specific industry? And if it's a jobs problem, then isn't it really up to the media to figure it out, not the government? Is it any different than grocery store clerks losing their jobs because there are automatic checkouts now? Is it any different than that if it's just a changing face of the medium? I don't think that it is. In a lot of cases, I think what the government is trying to do is salvage these jobs in a changing industry, and the industry is the one that needs to figure out how to adapt. But when it comes to public information, the idea that government meddling is something that's a good idea, or subsidizing is something that is a good idea, is really problematic, but it's also laughable, right? Government is inherently political. And the idea, I sort of see it, especially from an advocacy group perspective, as the same or similar to governments trying to limit third-party advertising or third-party activity in elections. And I find the idea that government or political parties can be the only ones that participate and have full free speech during an election as really problematic for democracy, but also laughable because government and political parties are the ones with the most direct incentives to influence those political outcomes. Their jobs are literally on the line. When I want to participate in an election by putting out an opinions editorial or a Facebook video or whatever it might be, my job is not on the line. We're trying to influence public policy processes because that's, our goal. And if some, Joe Blow in his bedroom wants to tape a podcast or something like that, I don't really see him as having his job on the line or that direct incentive that political parties and governments have in the same way. All election cycles is essentially a round and round and round merry-go-round of fake news. I mean, it's just political parties putting out rhetoric and half-truths, I guess you could say, about their opponents, and that's all that it is. So the idea that people wouldn't be able to participate in this process in the same way that political parties and governments who are desperately trying to cling to power can is very insulting to democracy. And it's also, I think, laughable that governments or political parties would be the ones to decide what is legitimate and what isn't. It's going to be inherently political no matter which way you paint it. And so that's the problem. And it's especially problematic when you get into subsidies, right? Get into government subsidizing what is and what isn't legitimate and being the ultimate decision maker on that. And even if you don't view this as a problem, obviously we view it as a problem at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation for the most basic reason is that government can't afford it. The government is deeply in debt. Justin Trudeau has added an additional $100 billion more than he said he would during their campaign. The government has no money to be subsidizing really any additional industries, but it's also just not really a necessary role of government or a legitimate role of government. But even if you don't buy that argument, think about what the concept, and Jen touched on this a little bit, but even just what the idea of subsidizing media has done to the political dialogue. A lot of people do not have faith in media and think that fake news is a big problem and think that the mainstream media is just spewing lies all the time. And I have worked in newsrooms, I've covered election campaigns as a reporter, I've worked on the advocacy group side of things. I have met people that think that the media is biased to the left and that all journalists are left-wing and they're always talking from that bias. And I have met people that think that all journalists are biased to the right and everything they're saying is corporatist and really right-wing and that's how they're influenced. I don't think that that is true. I have met journalists that bring their bias to work, and I have met journalists that are deeply committed to objectivity in their news coverage. I think there's a large spectrum there, and so I think also, let's look at the SNC-Lavalin scandal. I don't think that you can really credibly say, the media is all super biased in favor of Justin Trudeau, because the coverage of this scandal has been quite thorough, and there's been a lot of tough questions asked of the Prime Minister and his staff on this, and it's ongoing. So I don't believe that all of the media is biased, but I think that subsidizing the media is going to give the perception that media has a direct incentive to be biased, and that anybody who is tending to believe that media is biased is going to see a story, anything that's even vaguely, not directly critical of the Prime Minister, and say, well, of course they're writing that story because Justin Trudeau is buttering their bread. He's paying them off. And so that is a problem for journalism and for media outlets that subsidized or otherwise, they need people to want to consume their content long term in order to succeed. We know that you subsidize a pulp mill in a rural area or something like that, you might keep it alive for a little while, but long term, if it's not efficient, it's not going to survive. And it's the same for media. So long term, I think maintaining the credibility is a bigger issue for media and having this and having people want to consume their content. So the government directly subsidizing what they're doing is probably a bigger problem for that, or I think it is, long term. And that's why even if you don't believe from a principled standpoint that government shouldn't be subsidizing media, it provides that problem as well. So
Paige, we have a lot to unpack here, and so I'm going to just stop you there for a moment. because you have, and thank you all. Paige has touched on it quite a lot already, Jen, with respect to this sort of parallel issue that we have going on right now.
Yeah.
The federal government actually appointing the head of the Privy Council, would have been Warnick, but now it's the new guy, to oversee our election.
Yeah.
Your view on that issue, and then, and as I said, in parallel with that, is this whole notion of the bailout. And I noted you took some serious shots at the company that I work for, and because we are the biggest in the country, and then you used to work for it.
Nothing personal.
And you, but it's the biggest in the country,
Yes.
and so I think I want to get a sense from you on those two matters specifically,
Sure.
on the federal interference or oversight of the federal election and the bailout.
Sure. So, I mean, firstly, I'm very glad that Warnick resigned. I think he had to. I don't, if Andrew Scheer is prime minister and come fall, I don't think that there's any conservative government that would have allowed him to continue to operate, or could allow him to continue to operate after his performance in front of the Justice Committee. He went, to my mind, so far over the line into partisanship that there was no way that he could continue to do that job generally, and there was no way that he could have maintained the trust of a lot of Canadians, and particularly conservative Canadians, if he were overseeing an election. He just came across as far too in the tank for the Liberals, period. My understanding of the new guy, whose name eludes me, help me, is that he's highly recommended. He seems to be highly praised by people across the political spectrum. So, if the government is going to do this, I mean, you couldn't have Warnick do it. It has to be someone else. But I share Paige's concerns about this. I mean, one person's foreign interference is another person's, dude in a basement having an opinion and putting out a meme out there. Like I think we need really clear definitions of what we mean by foreign interference, and I haven't seen those definitions be very clear to date. I also am not. I just don't see any upside in this, and I also don't see a lot of evidence to show that foreign interference is the problem. Right? To me, it's not, if you look at, for example, the Washington Post articles that came out after all of the Russian election ads during the Trump election, the election ads of devil versus, Trump, and Hillary Clinton is portrayed as this evil demon. I just have a really hard time thinking that even en masse, that's what did it for Trump. Did it have an influence on the election? Yeah, maybe it did. But people still chose to join those groups. They still chose to share them. They still chose to engage with those ideas. Mm-hmm. So, as I said, is the problem foreign interference? Is the problem media? Is the problem social media? Is the problem us? Have we just not, as a society, caught up with where the technology is at? And that is, I think, something that we have to address at the civil society level, not at the government level. And the second question you had for me. Was it?
It's with respect to the bailout.
The bailout. Oh, and the media.
600 million plus that was announced for media outlets across the country.
And the credibility
is
issue?
Is this something that, I mean, as a newspaper editor, of course, I want to save jobs. I want to be able to continue to provide really good content, and I need bodies to do that. Logically, a bailout to all different types of newsrooms would provide that. But we have ongoing battles within our own newsroom, philosophical issues with respect to actually taking taxpayers' money to do independent journalism.
Yeah.
How do you think that works for us, and does it continue to compromise us?
Yeah, I mean, the second the bailout was announced, it compromised our credibility. It was done that moment. I mean, we don't even have to take the money at this point for the perception to be there. And I think the thing that's most concerning about this bailout and the way that it's structured for me is that it seems to revolve around this idea of an independent panel that's then going to decide who's qualified according to this incredibly rigged set of rules, right? Well, who's going to be on the independent panel? Is anybody I'm not going to be able to predict going to be on the independent panel? Is it going to be anybody who is not going to be an absolute staunch defender for the status quo and clinging on to that status quo with every single last dying breath? Absolutely not. It's not going to be. I can literally name the panel in my head now. I'm doing it. I'm doing it now. Ezra Levant's not going to be on it. I'm sorry. So the idea that there is any such thing as an independent panel. And then how does that affect coverage? How does that affect who gets assigned to what positions and what stories get assigned in order to ensure that you're meeting the standards of this rigorously dull Canadian panel? It's just, everything about this is a problem for me. And then the other problem that I have for that is that I think it leads us one step closer to credentialization. I don't think that journalism is like a special class of people. Journalism is just something that people do, right? And anybody can be a journalist. Anybody can do journalism. That is, we're not like a special anointed sect of the priesthood or anything of the sort. Some of us just manage to make a living at it. That's all. So the idea that we're getting closer and closer to a scenario where they have, for example, in the UK, where you have like a body of professional people saying, thou art a journalist, thou art not a journalist. That to me is very dangerous because essentially it creates a different class of citizenry that is unhealthy, and I just don't think it's conducive to a vibrant political debate and a vibrant marketplace of ideas.
Some wonderful people in the crowd who have downloaded the Attendify app, which you should all, have told us that it's Ian Shugart, who is now the new clerk of the Privy Council. So I suppose it's a good thing that we don't know his name, because we shouldn't want to know who he is.
Exactly.
Kevin, I'm gonna put this at you in a different perspective, because there is a notion out there, you know, the social media behemoths like Facebook, Google, Twitter, etc. You guys have not done enough to ensure not only the security of our data, and Cambridge Analytica and all these things come up, but I want to specifically sort of hone in with respect to the new legislation on C-76. This is, how do we feel confident, for starters, that whatever information is collected, and I know you guys specifically are going to only be doing the information on ads, correct?
Correct.
And it's a library of... maybe you can explain that to us, because you know, we are in this sort of digital age where we have ostensibly given everything over to Facebook, you know, all of our lives, you know, what we're eating, where we're going, who we're, like everything. Data privacy is a significant issue. How, I mean, aside from the $1.2 billion accounts you guys shut down, which is extraordinary, what other measures are you taking to ensure our privacy, our personal data is secure?
Sure. I mean, so C-76 first, about
C-76
sort of just
first,
generally how it works. So, this hasn't been built yet. So we are actually the product and engineering teams. I was just in Silicon Valley last week and was engaging with some of my colleagues there. So this is actually literally being built. I think I've read some stuff out there where some people have said, oh, well, this should be easy. And it actually, just to be very clear, is not. It actually takes a lot of time to get right. We have to build the systems. We have to debug them. We have to consult the advisory group. Then we got to build basically artificial intelligence systems that can proactively go and find and enforce on issues during the debate. So during the election. So this is not a trivial task, but if it works the way we hope it'll work, basically, if you intend to run a political ad, you know, during the pre-writ or writ period, then you're going to have to confirm in some way that you are in fact Canadian, because the law now says it's illegal, right, to try to run an political ad if you're not in Canada or not Canadian. And then what happens is we will take that ad, because you've declared it as being political, and that will sit in an ad library. So what this really is actually a transparency measure. So we're not taking anything that we didn't have before. People are not giving us anything that they didn't give us before, but now it's going to be open for anybody to see. And we have something similar up and running in certain countries, in the US and in the UK, for example, where you can actually go now, if you just search for this ad library, Facebook, it'll take you to this landing site. And you can now punch in kind of all sorts of keywords and pop up all these ads that are running on Facebook, whether they in real time or have been sort of archived. And you'll be able to see all the things that people have run. And so the whole idea is just to say, look, if you are a political party or a candidate, Canadians should be able to see sort of what ads they're running or have run. And if you're a third party, then people should also see that. But we absolutely think that it is important to be able to give people the ability to run ads on Facebook. You know, I think that's very important, and I think the law is very clear on that. But the law also requires us to create this ad library, and that's what we're doing.
And the storage is 7 years, but whereas Google has said they're not going to take any money for advertising at all, political advertising in the next election. Period.
Yeah, I think what they've said is they would that they will prevent or ban political ads on their platforms during the campaign. I mean, I just think for us, and we kind of released this blog post about a year ago when we were actually undergoing the same kind of debate. You know, in some ways, it's actually we felt it was in some ways easier to ban ads because then you just don't get dragged into this whole question of compliance. But as a platform where a lot of small businesses and a lot of activists and a lot of civil society people actually use Facebook to organize and mobilize and get their message out, we ultimately thought that, you know, to ban political ads on our platform would be a huge disservice to the promise and the potential and the value of digital ads. This is a hugely democratizing thing. It allows for smaller players to be able to get their message out in a way that only up till recently, only incumbents could do, or only large players with large budgets. And so for us, it actually is a very important and principled thing to be able to allow people to advertise with political messaging on the platform. Even though, as I said, to build these things is going to take a long time. We're working around the clock, taking us up to the end of June, and it is material and significant, the amount of time and resources that are put into this.
We have a lot of questions coming in on our Attendify app. Okay. Most of them are for you,
oh,
but I'm going
God.
to give you a break for a moment and sort of put this to Jen and Paige. Sure. And part one, government feels they need to intervene is because there's been a vacuum. And in your estimation, I'll start with you, Paige, have these social media giants done enough in order to combat this so-called fake news and you know, other aspects of bad actors interfering in what are in our democratic processes?
Well, I think we're in a place where everybody is adapting and everybody's trying to play catch up. So I don't know. I don't know if social media companies have done enough, but I know that government trying to interfere and control the situation is going to make it worse either way because of government's political incentives. And there's so much government policy as well that is designed around the idea that people are too stupid to make decisions for themselves, which is problematic for me. Whether it's, I mean, whatever, in every area of policy, people are too dumb to make their own decisions, so we need to meddle and we need to make those decisions for them. And this is really no different than that people are too dumb to discern content for themselves when they're seeing it on Facebook or Twitter, and they're going to be baited into believing all of this crazy stuff. Well, people are smart, and ultimately moving downward and democratizing the way that we consume content and information and share information is an empowering thing for people, and it's a good thing. So yes, I mean, social media companies are playing catch up. I think a big difference as well when you're dealing with social media companies versus the government is that it's completely voluntary. And if people don't want to participate in this, they don't have to. So when you join Facebook or Twitter, you know that it's up to Facebook and Twitter to make these decisions about how the platform works. And everybody participating knows that. So I don't know how to answer perfectly whether they're doing enough, but I don't think that government should step in and try to do more. It's up to these companies to figure it out, and it's up to the people who use those platforms to decide if they're doing that good job ultimately, because that's their call as a consumer.
You know, Jen, conservatives in general don't like a lot of government interference and intervention in pretty much any industry. But the challenge within these social media platforms is, as Paige said, everybody's trying to catch up. You know, there's congressional hearings, there's parliamentary hearings, and you know, trying to put forward legislation that covers it all. It's impossible to do that. But what, in your estimation, are we doing enough? Is there not enough happening? Why did we get to a point where we needed government legislation in order to handle some of these issues?
Well, I don't think we have really necessarily gotten to the point where we need government legislation to handle some of these issues. I mean, something Paige said in her opening statements I thought was really useful, and that was, you were talking about the history of Hearst and the fact that, you know, the origins of yellow journalism were profoundly self-interested, they were profoundly partisan, and they were very ugly. I think most people picking up a newspaper from 1910 would be horrified by what the sort of stuff that got published. And there was a 100-year process of developing standards, ethics, professional understandings, codes of conduct, in order to try and harness the extraordinary power of this new technology, which was I mean, it wasn't new in the 1910s, but which was the printing press, essentially. We're just going through that process again with the internet. That's what we're doing right now. And I mean, Facebook and other big media organizations are finding their feet in terms of ways to manage the downsides of this extraordinarily disruptive, chaotic new technology and channel it into something that's ethical and reasonable and not destructive to civil discourse. It's going to be a really interesting couple of years, if not generations. We'll get there. But government legislation was part of that process in the past. Of course, libel legislation, rules around defamation, and all that kind of thing. But I mean, different governments had different processes and different standards for that. And I think that we're going to start to see those types of emergencies appear in Canada versus the U.S. about privacy legislation. Privacy legislation in Canada is much stricter than it is in the U.S. is one of those interesting examples and differences. So, there's going to be a period of chaos and volatility while all of these organizations, including media organizations, are finding their feet and figuring out what works and what doesn't work and what's fundamentally destructive. And I think that there are going to be mistakes. And I think that that's just part of the process of society evolving to adapt to new technologies like this.
So I, again, appreciate all the questions that are coming in on the app, but we are nearing close to the end of this conversation. But I keep getting these notifications here. They want all of you, just in your view, to define what is fake news. Kevin?
Well, for us, we call it misinformation. And
of course you do.
Yeah, of course, yeah. And I mean, look, it basically for us, it actually comes in three flavors, if I may. Do I have time to do that?
You do.
Yeah, okay. So first is like spammy content, right? It's like people are like, you've all seen this online, right? It's like, you won't believe what he did next, right? And you want to know, right? So you click through, and then it takes you to the site, and oftentimes the site is really like there's nothing there. It's probably plastered with ads, and there's actually no content. So you're kind of like, well, this is really an unfortunate experience. It's really terrible because it was on our platform. But then the person who put that there just monetized because you clicked through. And so we want to be able to, over time, kind of downrank and ultimately remove spammy content because we don't think that's good for Facebook. It's not good for people. The second one is actually this question of trying to get at some kind of strategic outcome, right? So we saw that in the U.S. presidential, with Russian interference and putting certain content on the platform. And so for that, we do a lot of work. We have again, this sort of team of 30,000 people who are working on trying to figure out on the back end, from a cybersecurity standpoint, do we see linkages between sort of actors out there that are trying to influence the outcome of something that's strategic, like an election? And I have to say, in Canada, and it's not to say that it's not there, but for now, and we do scans continuously on the platform, we haven't found what we call coordinated inauthentic behavior on Facebook in Canada. We just haven't seen that kind of thing. And then the last one, and this is an important one, is people's legitimate opinions and their legitimate speech. They may have views, and however much in the minority, we don't think it's Facebook's role to be deciding what should stay up and stay down or go down on the platform. And so for people's views that are sort of potentially in the minority, I just want the audience to know we are seized with these things, and we do work very hard to make sure that we try to get that balance right. I'm not saying that we're 100% going to get it right every time. There are going to be false positives, I think, on either side. But I just wanted colleagues to hear from me directly that we are seized with it, and we do try to hold the line, which is why, in fact, you read a lot of criticism about how, wow, Facebook's not taking certain things down. Right. And it's because we do see the very strong role that freedom of expression plays in ensuring a vibrant civil society, and it is actually a cornerstone of what it means to have a free and open internet.
I think you're going to have a little harder time convincing some conservatives in this room and others that they think that that's actually not a reality.
And I hear you. So I welcome the conversation. We try really hard to do it. Again, like I said, I think we probably don't always get it right. So happy to chat with whoever. Come by our booth.
Yeah,
We'd love to have a further
invitation
conversation.
for all of you to visit him at the booth.
Please do.
Okay,
Please
Paige, your view on what fake news is or isn't.
Well, Yeah, so I think, and I said this a little bit in my intro statement, that fake news to me is something that is an outright lie disguised as something that is objective news coverage and is true. Something that baits people into thinking that it's coming from an accurate source or it's presented in an accurate way and that they can believe it, but in fact is actually something that is just completely false and not true. I don't actually think that that is what a lot of people are considering fake news to be. In a lot of cases, what I'm hearing people call fake news is simply opinions that they disagree with. And we are in a stage where news outlets put out a lot of opinions coverage. It's another problem with the subsidy, because does the subsidy go towards objective news coverage or does it cover opinions? We don't really know. But you know, that's not fake news. Just because somebody has an opinion that's different than you, I don't think that's what fake news is. What we should be legitimately concerned about are complete mistruths, that whether it's a foreign actor trying to purvey them as fact, or somebody who's domestic trying to purvey them as fact, that's something to be concerned about as a society that we have to grapple with. But I think that the definition that's being used of fake news is much broader than that today.
Jen?
Yeah, the problem with fake news is that one person's fake news is another person's opinion.
That's right.
And this is something we're going to struggle with. This is why I always take a sort of a non-prescriptivist view around journalism. I think we have to define journalism really, really broadly, and as much as possible, not keep stuff that I personally find distasteful or wrong-headed out of the bubble. I may not like the tactics of that particular news organization, or I may find that it doesn't meet my standard of journalism, but I don't want a government defining that, right? I want people defining that. So I think we have to define fake news very, very, very narrowly, and it has to be intentionally deceptive. It has to use lies. It has to lie. And it has to be being produced. I think it has to be being monetized. I think those would be my three keys. So somebody, your Aunt Edna, creating a conspiracy post about the the lizard people running the world, and it gets shared 100 times on Facebook. I don't really put that into the standard of fake news, because she's not monetizing that, right? She's not profiting off of that. But there are bad actors out there right now that have created WordPress templates, created what looks to be a superficial newspaper masthead, and are producing absolute crap with no sources and no bylines that is then being shared by Aunt Edna, who can't differentiate between that and what's appearing in the Globe and Mail or the CBC. That is my problem, because that fake news website is now monetizing lies, is actively eroding sort of public trust, and is actively eroding the sort of collective intellectual ability to suss out the difference between credible and non-credible news agencies. And they're doing it consciously. They're doing it consciously because of the templates and the fonts and the types of websites they're designing, right? I even saw one fake news website that had taken, I think, the headshots from an Edmonton City Council, and had taken those headshots and said that those were their news journalists, and created fake bios around those news journalists. That's not someone who has a difference of opinion. That's someone who's actively trying to deceive the public. That's fake news to me. But that is a very narrow definition, and I think we have to keep those definitions very narrow.
All right, I want to thank all three of you for a very thoughtful and rigorous conversation. Jen Gerson, Paige McPherson, Kevin Chan. Ladies and gentlemen, there will be no break between now